Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Diptarup Ghosh Dasidar and I'm an assistant professor in the Amity School of Languages, Amity University, Chhattisgarh. And today we are going to start talking about another poet of the Victorian age, and his name is Robert Browning. So before this, we have discussed two poems by Lord Alfred Tennyson. One is Ulysses and the second is The Lotos Eaters. And while discussing Tennyson, we have talked about the Victorian age itself, which is the same age in which we have Robert Browning. So, and since you can see 1812 to 1889, whereas the Victorian age can be said to be somewhere between 1837 to 1901. So, pretty much the Victorian age. Now, what was the Victorian age like? Once again, a short recap of it. Science was at the helm, religion was being questioned, so there was atheism, there was a rise in rationalism. Now, rationalism is something which has been there for a while, and somehow rationalism got linked with science at that time, and science had a development basically. So, at this juncture, Robert Browning, what is his standing? What kind of a person was he? What were his backgrounds? And what can we expect from his poetry? So, let's answer them one by one. Who was this person? Robert Browning. So, Browning was born in 1812 and he was born to a family which was pretty much evangelical in faith. So, what is evangelical? Let's come to that by understanding that Browning was mostly taught at home. So he was home tutored and he could not even go to the big universities like Oxford or Cambridge, and that was because his family believed in an evangelical faith. So what is an evangelical faith? An evangelical faith is when you believe in the ideals of Jesus Christ. It's a branch of Protestant, Christianity, where you believe in the ideals of Jesus Christ and you want to follow, the preachings of Christ, but you do not believe in the organization called church. So you are away from the organization, but you are with the religion in a rather transcendent sort of way. That is evangelical faith, and his family was evangelical in nature, and therefore they did not allow him to go to Oxford or Cambridge. And does it matter? Because Browning pretty much was a sharp kid. He did not just have a good upbringing at home, he followed, and he was a huge follower, he was a huge fan of a very famous romantic poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. So Shelley, we know Shelley to be one of the most revolutionary minds of the Romantic age, someone who went against God, someone who went against his family, his university. He wrote a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism, and because of this pamphlet, he was kicked out of his university. His family, completely left him, and he had to go away and live alone. So, taking from Shelley and copying Shelley was something that Browning did in the earlier part of his life. So in the first poems of Browning you find traces of Shelley. For instance, in his first published poetry, Pauline, in 1833. Now, when we say 1833, this was also the time when Lord Alfred Tennyson wrote Ulysses. And he lost his friend and he wrote Ulysses. And in 1833, Browning is writing Pauline, his first poem probably. Like, he has written more poems before, but this was the first published poem. And this poem, Pauline, is written in the style of Shelley. So you would find a lot of influences from Shelley in this poem, which later on, towards the late 40s and then the rest of his life, Browning left. So Browning developed his own style towards the end of his life when he is writing works like The Ring in the Book, very famous big works. In these works, it is completely Browning himself, and especially after he develops the style that we know him for. Everyone knows Browning for the style of the dramatic monologue. We have discussed the dramatic monologue when we discussed Tennyson, but we'll know more about it when we discuss Browning, because he is the one who pioneered the art of dramatic monologue. Now, moving on, he was a rationalist and he was an atheist, and all of that, it goes with his following of Shelley, and it was in 1846 that he got married to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So in 1846 he marries Elizabeth, and Elizabeth Barrett is actually 6 years elder to him, and she is also a poet, but she is not yet as famous a poet. And Browning by this time has got a good reputation. He has got a good reputation, and he has got a good image in the society. And when they marry each other, Browning encourages Elizabeth to write more love poems. And it is these love poems that make her an instant success among the English people. So when she writes these love poems, she is actually accepted by the public even more, and which leads to a growth in her poetic endeavors. Now, such was the growth in Elizabeth Barrett's poetic endeavors that in 1850, 4 years after they got married, and we know what 1850 is famous for. So 1850, William Wordsworth died, and William Wordsworth was the poet laureate of England. So who comes after William Wordsworth? It was Lord Alfred Tennyson. However, in 1850, such was the fame that Elizabeth Barrett got for herself that she was a tough contender for the post of the poet laureate. However, it went to Lord Alfred Tennyson, obviously, because he was way more famous than both of them, both the Brownings. So where does Robert Browning stand? Who were the people that gave more importance to Robert Browning than the others? These were some of the elite minds of England, and Browning was the only, I was about to say one of the few, but really not one of the few. He was probably the only person, the only artist, the only poet in England who actually had people working on him while he was alive. People talking about his poetry and doing discussions about his poetry, critical discussions, while he was alive. And at that time it was a big deal. So we have Browning societies thriving in England. And these Browning societies, what do? They discuss the poems of Browning, and they discuss about his techniques, especially the dramatic monologue, and we're going to talk about that later. They discuss about this, and this is all while he is still alive, which is a big deal. After he passed away, what happened is that there were some critical remarks on him, and for a time his fame dropped. But then again, with, let's say, the 1960s or the 1970s, people started bringing Browning back up. So Browning has pretty much always been at the center of critical debate, unlike Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was more of a popular success, and that was because of the content, that is love. So in here we see the relationship between Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning was, it's a relationship between two poets. What can you expect out of it? Obviously, it is going to end well. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning did not live long. She died in 1861. So she dies in 1861, and Robert is supposed to, a lot of marriage offers come to him. So he's supposed to marry someone else, but he doesn't marry anyone else. In 1889, Robert Browning passes away. He dies in Venice, and then he is buried. Where is he buried? He is buried in the Poets' Corner. So, where is the Poets' Corner? It is in a place called Westminster Abbey. So Westminster Abbey, the graveyard in Westminster Abbey is called the Poets' Corner because it is reserved for poets who have contributed to English literature, who have contributed to literature in some way. It could be art as well, but poets, so mostly you'll find the graves of the most famous poets over there. Geoffrey Chaucer. Also, Browning died in 1889. In 1892, Lord Alfred Tennyson died. And where was he buried? Yep, you got it right. He was also buried in the Westminster Abbey. He was also buried in Poets' Corner. But what's interesting is that Browning and Tennyson, they were buried at the same spot. So they were buried adjacent to each other. So you have Browning and you have Tennyson together. And it actually fits because Browning and Tennyson, their names are always taken in unison when we talk about Victorian poetry. Whenever we think Victorian poetry, there are two names. One is Tennyson, one is Browning. Obviously, I am probably doing injustice to other very famous British poets of the time. I'm Matthew Arnold, I'm so sorry, but these two poets have been the biggest names of the time, and they are there lying together. Lakshmikant Pyarelal, Vishal Shekhar, Macbeth Banquo. You always take these names together, don't you? So in his lifetime, he had got a lot of critical acclaim. He had got a lot of critical commentary, critiquing as well from others. But what is interesting is the kind of responses that people have made much later. So let's go to some of them. For instance, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is one of the most famous playwrights of the 1890s and the early 1900s. And Oscar Wilde says in the dialogue, The Critic as Artist, where he says that about Browning, that he is the most Shakespearean creature since Shakespeare. And then just to show how great Browning is, he says that the only man who can touch the hem of his garment, so the hem is the lower part of his garment, is George Meredith. George Meredith is a very famous novelist, also of the Victorian age, and we know that at the Victorian age, it's actually the time of novels. It's not really the time of poetry or drama, it is the time of novels. And yet, in such a time, Robert Browning made sure that poetry lived, and poetry did not just live, it took from drama, and people would read it. People in his time would read it, people after he died, we still read it, right? So Wilde goes on to say that the only man who can touch the hem of his garment is George Meredith. And he says that Meredith is a prose Browning, and so is Browning. He used poetry, so Browning used poetry as a medium for writing in prose. Such was the writing style of Browning that when you read Browning, you almost feel like you're reading a prose piece, or maybe you're reading a drama. And that's why dramatic monologue. We'll come to that. We have talked about the three main features of the dramatic monologue, but in Browning, we get much more than that. Also, Harold Bloom, who is a post-structuralist critic. Bloom is extremely fond of Browning, and he says that Browning is the most considerable poet in English since the major romantics, surpassing his great contemporary rival Tennyson. So Bloom goes on to say that Browning is much better than even Tennyson. And the principal 20th century poets, and not just Tennyson, even Yeats, Hardy and Wallace Stevens, who are big names in the earlier 20th century. But Browning is a difficult poet, a very difficult poet, notoriously badly served by criticism. Like I said, that many people criticized Browning, and ill-served also by his own accounts of what he was doing as a poet. So Browning was very humble about his own efforts. Browning did not really make a lot out of it, and unlike Byron wrote whatever he wrote. Byron was a popular success, and Byron was a popular success because his following was something that was contrived out of his, which came out of his own character. Robert Browning did not have a character in which he would have a fan following as such, and therefore he was just followed by the elite people. So this person, Browning, with such a background, he creates and he pioneers this style that we today know as the dramatic monologue. We'll discuss more about the dramatic monologue and the background to the poem in the next video. So we have understood the age and we have understood about Browning, a little bit about Browning. We'll understand the poem, what the poem is about, what we have in the poem, and what is the story behind the poem, because it is taken from a real life account. So which poem are we talking about? We are talking about My Last Duchess. So My Last Duchess, we are going to start talking about the poem My Last Duchess in the next video. Till then, take care. I'll see you again soon.